All right, Josh is currently our Regional Forest Program Manager, formerly from the Umpqua National Forest. He still remembers what it was like to be on an IDT. And he will share his wisdom. Help me thank Josh for being here, guys.
Well, thank you. And yeah, so this, I'm going to be talking about here today is based upon my work when I was a forest wildlife biologist, and it's definitely not just my work. Huge shout out goes to Richard Hellewell, our forest botanist. And then also we have some other folks in the room, Stephanie Wessel, Gabe Dumm, who helped kind of craft some of the information you're going to see here today. So what we'll be talking about is what's left, kind of looking at landscape level restoration considerations on a drier forest on the west side. So an overview here, I'm going to talk about the context of southwestern Oregon in regards to the range of the owl and the disturbance regimes. I want to talk about some of the stuff that Betsy's already talked about in regards to northern spotted owl, critical habitat, and recovery action considerations. And then want to go through the process that the Umpqua went through to identify drier forest restoration opportunities in southwestern Oregon. And then at the end, we're talking a lot of ecology, and we talked some cool social science stuff. But I also want to just talk about some brass tacks planning considerations for planning projects in stands over 80. So the Umpqua, here we are in southwestern Oregon. It's that hollow forest down there. I kind of think of it as a bird flying towards the west a little bit there, if you're oriented like that. We are in the kind of southern part of Oregon, in southwestern Oregon, and we're the transition zone. That blue line you see is one of those examples of physiographic province boundaries. So we're at the boundary between the Klamath and the West Cascades physiographic provinces there. And that line, depending upon who you ask, is kind of drawn farther north or farther south, but it always crosses somewhere on the Umpqua National Forest. And Chris set me up very well this morning there. Hopefully this will be a little bit more optimistic presentation, but the amounts of the Umpqua, amounts of critical habitat on the Umpqua significantly increased with the 2012 critical habitat final rules. So we're about 60% critical habitat now. Matrix is 65% critical habitat. And we're split, just like I said about physiographic provinces, for critical habitat subunits, we're split as well. The northern part is within the West Cascades, subunit 5. The southern third is the Klamath East subunit 1, and that pretty much corresponds with the Tiller Ranger District. And just here's another closer look at the critical habitat subunits on the Umpqua. You've seen a similar slide earlier. The brown is the matrix land allocation, the shades of green are LSR, and as you can see, there's kind of a mixture of critical habitat in and outside of matrix lands there, and also some LSR that's no longer critical habitat. And so within each subunit there are special, or within each province, there are special management considerations. And within the Western Cascades South, the special management considerations call on conserving stands that contain older and higher quality spotted owl habitat. And also calls upon us to really think about recovery actions 10 and 32, as Betsy talked about earlier. And then also talked about management emphasis needs to be placed on meeting spotted owl recovery goals and long-term ecosystem restoration and conservation. However, when there's a conflict between these goals, actions that would disturb or remove the essential physical or biophysical or biological features of NSO critical habitat need to be minimized and reconciled with that long-term ecosystem restoration goal. And so that is, there's a lot to that sentence there. And being that we need to balance what we're doing at the project level with the overall habitat amount and configuration at that subunit level. And a couple other management considerations, want to continue to maintain those large contiguous blocks of late successional forest. And then in areas that are not currently late sterile forest or high valued habitat, RA32 habitat, that's where we can consider more intensive forest management activities in matrix lands, like the ecological forestry considerations that Jerry was talking about, or that Jerry was asked about this morning. And then the Klamath East subunit. And again, remember, this is on one forest, and the line between the West Cascades and the Klamath East is not a bright line. It is a bright line on the critical habitat maps. However, the special management considerations of the Klamath East really can extend farther north into the West Cascades South subunit there. And we have been very fortunate to work with Jim Threlkill of the Roseburg Field Office and Scott Center out of the Roseburg Field Office in being able to apply some of these Klamath East special management considerations, which combine those moist forest management recommendations as well as the dry forest recommendations that occur for the east of the Cascades and farther south in the range of the spotted owl. And so those dry forest recommendations include the appropriateness of vegetation and fuels management in dry and mixed dry forests may be both appropriate within and outside critical habitat, where the overall goal of such treatment is to conserve the natural ecological processes or restore those ecological processes, including fire, where they have been modified or suppressed. And so this is really a critical consideration for the Umpqua National Forest, where we have these dry forested stands. Sometimes, well, in many cases, our watersheds, we have a combination of moist stands and dry stands within the same watershed. And so we apply this consideration sometimes on a stand-by-stand basis, depending upon where you're standing in your watershed. And then we can't get away with it. We've mentioned it several times today, but Recovery Action 32 is critical in implementing the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan and for managing for habitat for spotted owls. And so even if it's outside of critical habitat, if it's high quality, it's got structurally complex, it's got a large amount of canopy cover, it's got large amounts of snags and downwood, then we need to really take a close look at that and evaluate it. And if we agree as a level 1 team, hey, this is high quality habitat, we're not going to treat that. We're going to set that aside. We're going to look at different options to maybe treat around it, maybe treat it with only prescribed fire, just walk away. With Ray Davis's help and Terry Stone's help, we developed a methodology back in 2008 when the Recovery Action 32 first came about to try and identify, at a watershed level based upon orthophoto interpretation as well as subsequent field visits to map at a watershed by watershed basis where that high quality owl habitat is on a project by project, watershed by watershed basis. And Jane did a really good job talking about fire history. And so some of this stuff is going to look familiar, and Ray, this stuff will be updated next week, but this presentation is a week too early to show you the new information there. This comes from the 15-year monitoring report. The 20-year monitoring report will come out next week there. But within the range of the spotted owl, fire by far is the number one source of habitat loss across the range. And particularly if you look, in southwestern Oregon, there's a lot of fire-prone habitat down there, and there's also a lot of habitat that has already burned up. In the Biscuit Fire in 2002, over 500,000 acres on the Rogue River Siskiyou. On the Umpqua National Forest in the past 12 years, had roughly 140,000 acres of wildfire. We're averaging about 30% high severity stand replacement there, so that's roughly a loss of about 40,000 acres of spotted owl habitat. In that 15-year report, it identified over 900,000 acres of fire-prone spotted owl habitat in the Oregon West Cascades, and most of that occurs in the southern portion, which is the Umpqua. And so all of that combined with what Chris presented this morning, where the Umpqua had been in thin-end plantations to try and to increase the development of those stands in the late succession, while also at the same time trying to meet our timber target there, we were running out of plantations, and that's not a long-term viable strategy. And at the same time, we're losing habitat to wildfire across the forest there. And so having been there, worked on the Umpqua for 7 years, wanted to try and make a pitch to the forest leadership team, hey, let's try and do something a little bit different here. We can't just thin our way out of plantations and still meet what we're being asked to meet from a volume expectation. So let's try and identify in an interdisciplinary fashion what our restoration opportunities are on the Umpqua National Forest there. And let's try and focus on outcomes in regards to the work we're doing on the ground rather than those board foot outputs there. Those board foot outputs are going to be there in some fashion, but that's not the driver where we need to go. We need to think about what we want that landscape to look like in the long term. And so Alice made a pitch to the forest leadership team to give us some time to be able to develop a restoration strategy. And to her, the FLT's credit, and to Alice Carlton, the forest supervisor's credit, she said, yep. And not only do I want you to identify what the restoration needs, I want you to prioritize them by what needs are the most urgent there. And so then, as a secondary piece to that, we want to identify restoration needs, but we also want to identify where there are opportunities for standalone timber sales in the matrix land allocations, and, if possible, outside of critical habitat. And so that was a separate process. I'm not going to talk about that today. Those opportunities are limited, but we did identify a few of those, and you can ask me about that afterwards there. And then we also wanted to be able to help inform the districts on what vegetation management data needs are, and then how can we strategize as a forest to go about and acquire those vegetation data. And so the concept of the restoration strategy is to identify what restoration needs are most urgent, and then spatially identify where our most urgent restoration opportunities are across the forest. So what are the restoration needs? And so, you see that list. I'm not going to read it out to you, but it's stuff that you guys have heard about in various forms today. I just want to notice for the fish bio out there, riparian thinning is in here there, so we did consider fish. And I also want to highlight that how we came about these restoration needs is that forest program managers in an interdisciplinary fashion were sequestered in our supervisor's office in July for 2 weeks, much to the chagrin of Richard, our forest botanist, and the rest of us actually. And we brainstormed what are the most lists. And we had Gabe, our fuels ecologist there. We had our forest fish bio. We had our forest hydrologist. We had Stephanie, silviculturist there. We had myself as a wildlife biologist, and we brainstormed and came across this list of what our restoration needs, what we felt our restoration needs are in the forest. And Richard, bless his heart, as a botanist and a fan of systematic and data-driven means to quantify our rankings there, developed this pairwise comparison matrix where each specialist ranked those restoration priorities from most urgent to least urgent there, and then we compared this in this matrix, and just cross your eyes, and you don't need to focus on the numbers there. Just this was the means of being able to develop this, our prioritization for what the most urgent restoration opportunities are on the forest. And the first one, the top of the list, is fire resiliency and northern spotted owl habitat. I'm going to just focus on kind of the first 5 here because you're going to see, obviously, there's a common theme in there. The second one is sugar pine and western white pine health. Sugar pine, a fire-dependent species. The third, white bark pine health, also fire-dependent, not as many hands-on management restoration opportunities, being that a lot of the white bark pine occurs in our wilderness areas, but it's still, we have so little of it, it is of urgent need to be able to try and maintain that across the landscape. Number 4 is oak habitat restoration, both Oregon white oak and black oak. And number 5 is ponderosa pine health. And obviously, all 5 of those have that common theme of fire dependency and the need for fire to maintain those habitats, and then the loss of some of those individual species through competition due to our past history of fire suppression. And so to kind of identify where is the areas on the landscape that have the highest restoration need, we looked at various data sets there. So we looked at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service habitat model for northern spotted owl. We looked at the 15-year monitoring plan, more stand-level NERF habitat model. We looked at aspect and slope models. Richard developed a sugar pine habitat model, and then we looked at some other GNN data sets for looking at pine distribution. And then looked at those in an individual fashion and looked at them cumulatively to try and identify where we could identify some projects to plan restoration activities there. And so here's just some visual representations of those. So this is that large fire suitability model that Cheryl just talked about, developed by Ray for the 15-year monitoring map for the northern spotted owl. It's been a very effective model in identifying fires where they have grown big across the region. It's fun calling Ray during the fire season to see him giggling and say, hey, did you see this fire? It's right in a red spot there. And it's been incredibly accurate for us in southwestern Oregon on identifying where potential larger fires are. And some of the key variables were August max temperature, slope, lightning ignitions, and then distance to road. And then we overlaid that large fire suitability model on both the 15-year monitoring report, nesting, roosting, foraging habitat map to kind of look at stand level NERF habitat that is at high risk or high suitability for a large fire to develop. And then we also looked at it with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service habitat model. And so here's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service relative habitat suitability model. The cool thing and the different thing about this model is that it also considered abiotic factors, so topographic position, slope, and curvature and insulation. And then it's also smoothed at that 200 hectare scale, so it kind of aggregates some of that higher, larger amounts of habitat in a more smooth fashion, so you could identify bigger patches pretty easily by using that and overlaying it with the large fire suitability map. Then also the fire history layer. We have, you've seen various versions of this today in Jane's talk and a couple others there. Two different forest inventories, the Oregon Department of Forestry map from 1914, and then the Forest Resource Inventory 1930 to 1936, which Connie Harrington then helped digitize. These are all GIS layers, and key thing to focus on is those, again, as Jane said, are not entire fire perimeters, but those are areas that stand replacement wildfire. And then we also we put on, our wildfires since from 1970 through 2014. Those are the entire fire perimeters. But as you can see, on the Umpqua, from a north to south gradient, we've got a pretty significant portion of the landscape that's already been affected by fire. And so how we've utilized the historic fire layers is, as Cheryl just showed in her last landscape, some of these historic fire areas are where you can identify stands that are over 80 or right around 80 that could benefit from some diversification, and also that these areas are areas that likely could be susceptible to burning again in the future here. And so this is a key consideration for identifying planning areas. And then also, because you look at your restoration priority areas and like, oh yeah, that would have been a priority 10 years ago before it burned up. So now we got to look somewhere else. So this is that sugar pine habitat suitability model that Richard developed there. Sugar pine are being crowded out as a result of fire suppression across the landscape. And so they really benefit from a releasing of these legacy sugar pines from encroachment. And then, for all of these dry forest pine treatments there, we want to follow these up by treatment with prescribed fire. So we utilize that model to identify areas where we had sugar pine, where that would be a key dry forest restoration opportunity. Here's just an example of a sugar pine carcass up on Cottage Grove. And people say Cottage Grove's an asbestos forest. Well, it's not true. They had a fire there last year that burned up onto them, and they have some fire-dependent species up there. The next one is Oregon white oak distribution, and does that show up? Yeah, you can see a speckling there, a small little Rorschach of Oregon white oak. It's a more rare species on the Umpqua, which is also suffering from encroachment by conifers due to fire exclusion. These oak woodlands are, from a wildlife habitat perspective and from a biodiversity perspective, are incredibly important pieces of diversity, and they also provide great opportunities for restoration objectives consistent with the critical habitat rule. And we have black oak. It doesn't really map out well using the GNN data, but we do have black oak that's been well mapped out by Amy Nathanson, our area ecologist, and we're targeting those areas also for restoration. And here's some examples of some oak carcasses up on Oak Flats on the Diamond Lake Ranger District there, where forest succession is basically overtopped the oaks, and we've got nothing but shells of them left. And then finally, Ponderosa pine distribution. This is coming from the GNN data set there. So Ponderosa pine on the Umpqua presents, again, more opportunities for restoration, as they're also being encroached upon by conifers where fire has been excluded. And, just like with sugar pine and the oak, these are areas where a more frequent fire return interval would have occurred had it not been for, our past management fire suppression activities. And here's just some examples of what that encroachment's looking like for Ponderosa pine down in Elk Creek. And I know this is a workshop on over 80, but on the Umpqua National Forest, you can't just manage for over 80, you can't just manage for under 80, you got to manage for both there. And based upon some of the post-fire monitoring work that occurred in 2002 and stuff we also saw, with the Douglas fire and fires across the region, older stands adjacent to younger plantations are more susceptible to higher severity fires than they are just by themselves. And so we got to consider older stand proximity to these younger stands, whether or not we've been able to treat these younger stands, and evaluate whether or not there needs to be some level of fuels reduction work in the adjacent older stands to try and moderate fire activity and reduce fire severity in those older stands adjacent to there. And then getting down to some more kind of general stand concepts here. Topography as a template for diversity. I stole that from Tom Spees. I liked it. It sounded like a little haiku. And on the Umpqua and across the northwest there, north aspects, and particularly north aspects with gentler slopes, are areas less likely to burn at moderate to higher severities. And so these are areas where we really want to focus on maintaining the older forestry there. So areas that we would likely not want to treat with mechanical means, areas to potentially put some prescribed fire in the ground, or if we have younger stands, these are areas we really want to focus on advancing their ability to develop into late successional characteristics, because these have an ability to potentially persist longer in the face of future fire disturbances. And so this is just an example of a small little north aspect lightning fire occurred on the Tiller Ranger District in 2013. It was one of those ones where the firefighters, take their lunch and walk slowly to the woods. They got to go put a line around it, but they're in no hurry because it's not doing nothing but good, just skunking around. An example of a nice underburn from naturally started lightning ignition. And so just to kind of put it back to how we use those layers to identify restoration needs, we considered, fire resiliency and owl habitat, the probability of large fire, and then pine health as those main indicators. That boiled it down to identifying two real critical areas, the Jackson Creek watershed and the Calf and Copeland watersheds. Both of those areas had high amounts of nesting, roosting, foraging habitat. They had high amounts of highly suitable habitat available to develop into large wildfires. The Calf Copeland watersheds has high densities of sugar pines in localized areas there. The Jackson Creek watershed has a significant portion of both the sugar pines and ponderosa pines, as well as some oak habitat in there. Calf Copeland also has a little bit of oak. And so those are areas that we've identified for potential future projects there to start prioritizing for treatment for increasing the resiliency of these stands. Adjacent to both of these areas, so we had the Bose Rainbow fires right here. If it hadn't been for a season-ending event, Calf Copeland wouldn't be a project area because it would be a fire event. The Tiller Complex in 2002 burned up right here. The Whiskey Complex in 2013 burned right in here. And so these are areas where, it's just a matter of time, and we have an opportunity to do actual restoration work, focus on reducing fuel loadings, doing it at a landscape level, and maintaining owl habitat. So here is just a couple, it's been mentioned several times today, just want to get to some last minute considerations when you're planning in these stands over 80. Recovery Action 10 is, I think, nobody's mentioned the U word, but there's potential for uplisting for the northern spotted owl. There's a petition the Fish and Wildlife Service is considering, and I think Recovery Action 10 is going to play a really critical role in forest planning to document how we are maintaining those known sites where we have reproducing pairs and where we have currently occupied pairs. Those are going to be critical to know where those locations are across the landscape, and to be able to do that, we need to do surveys. And so that's 2 years protocol surveys. We need to have those spatially mapped, and we need to be treating adjacent to those, but not necessarily within those. We need to be able to maintain those as to the best we can to be reducing the take that we might be issued for planning these restoration projects there. Also, along with the 2-year northern spotted owl surveys, now with survey managed surveys, we're back to implementing the 2001 ROD with the 2003 species list plus red tree voles. That's a lot of survey work. That's a high cost in the planning effort, and it also takes a lot of time because really you need to know where your owls are, you need to know where your survey managed species are on that landscape, and then you need to identify where your units are, not vice versa. And so that's really 3 to 4, and those are kind of optimistic. It could be more 3 to 5 year planning timeframes there. And then another one on the Umpqua red tree voles, incredibly common on the Umpqua in a variety of stand types and species of trees. They under 4,500 feet elevation. Managing 10-acre buffers around those sites is not going to be achieve landscape level restoration objectives there, and so we really need to work with the regional office on identifying non-high priority site management plans, and then maybe down the line looking at conservation assessments for the species at a forest level to assure species persistence, to assure habitat connectivity, but also to be able to address some of these restoration opportunities and restoration needs we have in these drier forest stands. And then this last one, the social scientists folks, they've whacked us up the head very well on this one. That's not, we're not managing trees, we're not managing owls, we're managing people. And we're trying to work with people. And so extensive work with partners and other interested publics is absolutely critical. None of this work can get done if you don't have successful planning and implementation partnerships with the public. And so on the Umpqua National Forest, I got to call them out. We got Stan Petrowski, South Umpqua Rural Community Partnership, who has been a vital linkage for the forest in working with the environmental communities, working with the timber industries, working with local landowners within the forest, in helping deliver the message of why we need to treat, because at least it's been my experience, and then Patty O'Brien as well, people listen to the Forest Service, but they're like, yeah, kinda, we might believe you, but you still want to get the cutout, don't you? But when it's their neighbor talking to them about the need for why you need to treat in these stands, how you're going to increase landscape resiliency, and why we're not just out there to get the cutout, we're out there to maintain late successional forest on the landscape in a diversified fashion, it's a much more compelling case than having somebody in a pickle suit tell them that. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
One quick one, if anyone. Quick question.
So thanks for a great summary of the issues and the need for doing the treatments and the restoration kind of stuff. Do you have any optimism, though, with budgets, workforce, trying to get smoke clearance for the need for prescribed burning, that there's going to be any increase in the pace and scale?
Well, regionally, so I can put my region hat on. Regionally, the money's been going to northeastern Oregon right now, with congressional input for increasing the pace and scale. So I think I'm gonna take my agency outfit off there. I think it's gonna need to be a combination of managing wildfire, and as we have been managing wildfire, kind of taking the big box approach in conjunction with these thinning mechanical and prescribed fire treatments. The windows for prescribed fire treatments on the southwest, we're all planning for late season fall burns there, where that window is 2 to 3 weeks. But you need that first shot of rain, and then you need it to dry out, and then you need a season-ending event to get in there to get that drip torches in there, and that's just we've not had good success in that. But we have had good success in managing fires and natural disturbance. Like I said, on our wildfires, we've only had about 30% high severity, and so that's 70% low to moderate severity, which is pretty damn good. So it's going to be a combination, and again, this is Josh, not the Forest Service Josh, but just Josh talking. A management of mechanical thinning and then management of wildfire.
Well, help me thank just Josh, everybody.